if you are constantly stimulated, then you never actually have to focus on anything for long periods of time. And multitasking, as I've said before, is actually a myth. We can't actually multitask. What our brain is doing is it's very quickly switching between tasks. And so it's not actually doing multiple things at once, but we're forcing it to switch and to go between tasks. So every time we switch from one tab to another, every time that a different input comes in, our brain has to switch gears. And that's actually incredibly draining on our resources. And it's also a detriment to our concentration ability. And so one way to manage this is to actually not do that, to take a step back and to have periods of time, pockets of time where you manage social media, and then other pockets of time when you actually don't do that and when you turn it off. If you're like me, you have to actually use a software program to block the internet, which I have to do when I write. Otherwise, I get terribly distracted. It's hard for me to practice what I preach. But if you have the self-control not to, then by all means, you don't need to block the internet. But I think it's important to have those periods of time just with yourself when you're not distracted so that you don't forget what that feels like. And that will actually make you better able to deal with the information deluge when you're dealing with it, because it will make your brain a little bit sharper, a little bit better at focusing. There are multiple parts to thinking like Sherlock Holmes, but the central element that really ties it all together is mindfulness, is being really aware of the present moment and being able to filter out distractions. It's what Holmes tells Watson. It's the difference between seeing and observing. And Holmes observes in everything he does, which means that he actually has trained his concentration abilities so that he takes in what's going on and he knows how to take a step back and how to give his brain the space that he needs to think. Because the other element of that, of course, is that Sherlock Holmes is remarkably imaginative and creative. People often think that he's this just logical computer, but he can do things that no computer can do because he has this ability to be creative and to step outside of himself and to think in ways that haven't been thought of in the past. And I think the reason that he has this creativity, which is one of the reasons that he's so successful, is that he does have this presence of mind, and he's not afraid of being quiet. He's not afraid of distancing himself from the world. He's not afraid of saying, you know what, I realize someone's been murdered. I realize that you're really anxious for me to get going. Please go away. I'm just going to sit here in my chair, smoke my pipe, and think. And that's what really enables him to get ahead of the detectives that immediately start jumping in line to say, okay, what are we doing? Let's go to the crime scene. Let's do this. Let's do this. Holmes really isn't afraid of taking those breaks. And I think we need to remember that, and we need to not be afraid of doing the exact same thing. There are a few lessons. One of them would be not to jump right away, to see what's going on before you jump, because if you don't take the time for a little bit of quiet reflection beforehand, you might find that it actually ends up slowing you down. So you got in the race faster, but you didn't realize quite what race you were getting into. And if you had taken the time beforehand to actually think it through and to do all of that legwork, you might find that even though you enter it at a slightly later point, you then accelerate much faster, which is exactly what Sherlock Holmes does. And the other lesson I think that we can take from him is to be incredibly scared of being overconfident, because this is Holmes's shortcoming. When he is overconfident, which does happen, he doesn't solve the case properly, and Holmes does make mistakes, and he does have cases where he overlooks obvious things because he's so incredibly confident that he's an expert at what he does. And I think especially successful entrepreneurs who've done things successfully in the past, it's very easy to let that blind you and to let that stop you from evaluating everything properly because you think you're golden. And trying to have a little bit of intellectual humility, I think, is incredibly important. The number one thing we can do is to take some time every day, and it can be as little as a few minutes, to just sit quietly with your own thoughts and with no distractions, and to let your mind just focus on the present moment. Kind of a shortened modern day practice of mindfulness meditation. And everyone can take a few minutes to do that. Even Ray Dalio, who's the founder of Bridgewater, the largest hedge fund in the world, actually meditates every morning. And he often does it just in his office, sitting in his chair before he starts his morning meetings, because those few minutes of being just alone with your own thoughts can really make you much sharper for the rest of the day. So I think that is something that is very good to keep in mind, and a very good first step towards thinking like Holmes. The second thing I would do is try to limit your multitasking as much as possible. Obviously, you realize that in the modern world it's impossible to not multitask all the time, but to either carve out your time or manage your time in a way that you're not always trying to juggle multiple things at once. And obviously this has to do with setting expectations as well, in the sense that everyone expects you to get back to email within minutes, because they know that you can get it wherever you are, because you have a smartphone, you have this, you have that. You're never really inaccessible anymore, but you can make yourself inaccessible. You can say, you know what, I don't respond to emails right away. I will get back to you within X amount of time, and that will give you some sort of peace of mind as well, and be able to manage it on your own time. And there are time management strategies that can help with that. And another thing that's incredibly important is realizing what is important to you, setting your own goals. So Holmes is a detective. So for him, the things that he has to focus on are people, are places, things that matter in crimes. We're not all detectives. So we need to realize that attention is incredibly finite, that it's a precious resource that we need to allocate strategically. So take a moment to think for yourself, okay, to what do I actually want to pay attention? Knowing that my resources are limited, how am I going to use them? And how am I going to deploy them to greatest effect? And that's an incredibly important thing to remember.